People arriving in Irish ports and airports will need a negative COVID-19 test from Friday. The Cabinet has agreed there are rushed measures being put through the Oireachtas. Travellers can have either a professional antigen test, not a personal one, not one you'll buy in your local supermarket, taken a maximum of 48 hours prior to arrival, or a PCR test, much more expensive, but that can cover you up to 72 hours earlier. Now, the requirement for a negative test applies to all arrivals, including those from Britain, though not if you're going the other way. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. Eoghan Corry is from Air and Travel magazine and is always well informed on these subjects. Good morning, Eoghan.
Good morning, Mick.
Bit of a rush job getting all of these things in. One rule coming one way from the UK, one rule going the other way.
Absolutely. It's pantomime season, but it's not funny. We've really broken with the spirit of what was agreed last July to reopen travel within the European Union. The emergency brake system, which was implemented then, was designed to cope with a situation from a country outside the European Union ran into a serious spike in infections or a threat, and the European Union as a whole would move. We have decided to move to restrict travel from other European countries, EU countries, and as you say, very much a rush job.
Okay, and I was just going to harp on that point, actually. The spirit of this agreement has been broken yesterday by Ireland.
Very much. The European Commission looked in dismay at what happened the day before. We were the last to sign up for this. We signed up several weeks after everybody else. We introduced it several weeks after everybody else. We did the famous mandatory hotel quarantine in January. We were the only country in Europe to do that. So generally on travel, we've been sort of the laggards. We've been dragging our heels on reopening travel or getting people moving again after COVID. But this, we weren't the first to jump on this. Portugal jumped, but Portugal, as listeners may know, had a very spectacular incident over the weekend at the Belenenses Benfica match. 7-0 at half-time, had to be abandoned second half. Belenenses had 13 cases of the new variant. But, the Prime Minister, Costa, on the day before yesterday, introduced a measure that, very restrictive measures, things like you will now need to be have proof of a test to get into nightclubs and things like that. But they also introduced tests for people travelling into Portugal. Now, that came before the Cabinet yesterday. We decided to go along with it. The European Commission looking with dismay at what's happened in two of its countries, because this is the first test of the coherent travel policy that was agreed across Europe to keep us moving as a unit. We're supposed to be a 27-country unit, not 27 countries running off in different directions every time they come any sort of obstacle appears.
Okay. Now then, this begs an awful lot of questions. Let's kick into them.
A lot.
If you're unlucky enough to test positive in the country you were visiting, would you be denied entry to Ireland or given access to the plane even?
No, absolutely not. You don't. It doesn't matter whether you've got a test or not. If you've got COVID symptoms, you're not flying. You get, everybody doesn't read the flash that comes up on your mobile phone when you're checking in. But among the questions you have to answer is, have you any symptoms, or do you think you're suffering from COVID?
Okay.
You're absolutely not. So any negative test, you're not flying. You're staying in the country until you're clear and you have a positive test.
Okay, so if you test positive while intending to come back to Ireland, would you then have to quarantine for a fortnight, maybe 10 days, 5 days in the country you were in?
It depends on the local regulations, but generally anybody who tests positive for COVID is quarantining across Europe. Okay,
but in the UK you would get in. As I understand, the rule is to test and quarantine on arrival from the UK.
Well, the interesting thing about the UK, and Boris Johnson said to speech on Saturday night, is that he is testing everyone arriving. Basically, the UK saying we don't trust anybody else's system, so you test at the airport or within 1 day, and if you test positive, obviously the quarantine applies.
Okay. Now, if you're travelling as a couple or a family, what happens if only one person in your party tests positive?
It doesn't affect the other party, except in this one key important area for the consumer. Most insurance policies now allow you to postpone and claim if a direct partner tests positive. So let's say there are two together, the insurance policies cover your direct partner. Now, they can cover direct relatives, close relatives. They don't tend to cover every member of a football team or a gang of lads going to Santa Ponsa.
Okay. Now, if you're travelling to the UK for a weekend, a sports event or something, a short stay like many people do, a bit of shopping or whatever, would you be able to take your PCR test in Ireland before you leave?
Very much. PCR is 72 hours, so you will get over and back to Old Trafford. With you, I'm sorry, I've insulted everybody.
I didn't mention Old Trafford. You must be a Man United fan.
I am as old sports. I'm a former sports editor, so as old sports journalist, I am completely neutral on the subject. But I do know that the Manchester United Liverpool are the two ones that most of the charters from Cork would go to. But anyway, you will get over and back to your race meeting or whatever on a 72-hour PCR test, and a 48-hour antigen test also does it. The key to this is if you're vaccinated, antigen will do on your return. So let's say you show up at the airport, you say, oh, I'm not tested. PCR would be a bit of a drama. You have to do it the day before. Antigen, you'll get your result in less than half an hour. I've been at events where you've had to be antigen tested for entry, and in some cases you'll have the result back in 7 or 8 minutes. So an antigen will get you back. Don't panic if you arrive at the airport, you haven't been tested. Antigen will get you home again, but you have to have been vaccinated. If you haven't been vaccinated, they will look for the PCR.
Okay, see, as you're a Man United fan, I'll just recount. I got in a bit of trouble yesterday with Man United fans for saying to Rory, our head of sport, that Ralph Rangnick had promised the board of Man United, the players of Man United and the fans of Man United that he would guarantee they would be in a major European competition next year, even if he had to write the song himself.
Very clever, very clever. I won't join the Man United joke. I've got enough trouble down the years for that. Yeah.
Okay, now big question. Is there a danger of Belfast becoming the back door to Ireland because you don't have to show a negative test when flying from Britain to Northern Ireland?
It's a lot of trouble to go to Belfast from most. If you're north of the Dublin Galway railway line, it's not that big a deal. It is a big deal actually from the west because the roads are terrible. It's not really worth the trouble to save an antigen test, which can be €8.
May not be worth the trouble to save an antigen or PCR test, but may be worth the trouble to avoid mandatory quarantine.
Well, you're only facing. You're not getting on the flight if you tested positive anyway. So it's not going to make a difference from mandatory quarantine. Mandatory quarantine is in for the 7 countries from the 7 countries around South Africa. I was going to say in South Africa, but in the southern part of the African continent, there are 7 named countries, most of which don't have direct flights to the European Union. But if you're coming into England from South Africa, for instance, and those 3 flights, the 2 Johannesburg and the Cape Town, are running, daily flights are running at the moment again. If you're coming into you are going to face that anyway for arriving in the UK. So there's no question, really. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense of using Belfast as a backdoor because the antigen test applies and it's not as expensive as the PCR.
Great. Just a few more questions, Eoghan Corry. Very, very informative, as always. Does it seem strange to you that the government, and Simon Coveney in particular, welcomed Ireland's exemption from UK travel rules on Sunday as fantastic news, and then 2 days later they introduced those same rules to GB travellers?
It is absolutely beyond belief that the common travel area, which is being observed to the letter of the law by Boris Johnson, sceptical as he is about...
and in Europe as he ain't.
And absolutely sceptical as he is on everything, the protocol, everything. He's observing the common travel area to the letter of the law. We're not. And this is not the first time. Let's say, so look at locator forms. You don't need a locator form to fly to Britain. You do in the other direction. Some Tory MPs in the House of Commons have been sounding out about this and being very vociferous on how Ireland are the ones turning their back on the common travel area, not Britain.
Okay. A couple of questions around antigen testing and COVID traces in the system. I'm not sure if you can answer this. Does an antigen work if you had COVID 3 weeks ago? Would it still show traces of COVID on it?
The important thing with the antigen is that your home test will not suffice, and we have no definition as to what the tester's results will be. I don't actually know the specific answer to that question. That's not my field, but this is important. The airline staff are the ones who are tasked with deciding, is this a home test, an antigen home test, or is it a professional test? There's no definition, Mick, of professional test. Does Does it have to be a doctor, or will a pharmacist do? And what happens in Bulgaria when you turn up at the gate with something in Cyrillic alphabet? It's a really big difficulty that it's not going to be epidemiologists or microbiologists who are going to be assessing this. It's going to be someone at a gate letting someone on an aircraft trying to decide whether this fits the definition of a professional antigen test, which the government itself has not provided.
Yes, which will cause worry. That will cause cancellations as well. What about somebody going for their booster?
It's more likely to cause denied boarding, and that's the biggest problem for the individual passenger.
Yeah, probably not your area as well, Eoghan Corry, but what about somebody going for a booster and intending to get a PCR to travel a few days later? Will the booster affect the PCR, I wonder?
No idea.
Okay.
No idea.
We'll ask that to the relevant people then. Caller going to England on December the 11th, staying for 22 hours. What would they do? That would be get a PCR test and cover yourself both ways, yeah?
PCR or even antigen will cover you both ways. Antigen is 48 hours.
Okay. Let's look at people's general travel plans. There are people with many, many family members intending to come inwards. There are people with many, many travel plans intending to head outwards before, during and after Christmas and New Year. What's the general advice to these people now? Does it look like travel will still be allowed, albeit with these increased restrictions and recommendations for PCR and antigen?
What I'd hope will happen is after 2 weeks, this thing about requiring tests will be dropped. It'll be dropped because the European Commission doesn't like it, and there'll be some sort of engagement at that level. The antigen test is not expensive. The PCR test actually has come down in price. It used to be around 95. It's now around €40 outbound from Ireland. But most PCR tests through Europe are much, much cheaper than they are in Ireland. So it's not that the inconvenience of a PCR test is no longer an issue, because if you're vaccinated, an antigen will do. As I say, an antigen result can be provided in half an hour. Don't stop travelling. It's not that big a deal. It's not that big a deal. It's the equivalent of sometimes you run into a 3-hour security queue when airports are short-staffed. It happened in Dublin a few months ago. It happened in Lyon to me not too long ago. You know, it's the equivalent of a bad day at the airport when the queues are slow. Getting that extra antigen test. Don't stop travelling. It's not enough a reason to reconnect families. Families have been waiting for 20 months to see each other.
Okay, so as a travel correspondent, you were saying to people, don't alter your travel plans. Stick and abide by the new rules. Keep yourself as safe as possible, but travel.
And you know, let's behave abroad as we do at home. You know, travel to Waterford and travel to Spain are pretty much the same since the advent of low-cost aviation. Sometimes the flight is cheaper than a bus fare. So what we should be doing is abiding by the rules, local rules. What the Irish health authorities say, what the Spanish health authorities. There's little differences everywhere, but you don't walk down Los Ramblas in Barcelona with your handbag open. When you're abroad, don't put yourself in situations where you think you might get infected. Remember, we're the 9th highest in Europe. We're about the top 1/3 for infection rates. And most countries would have much lower infection rates. Spain is the second lowest at the moment. But don't put yourself in a situation where you're either exposing yourself to COVID, that's very obvious, but also exposing yourself to the wrath of the health authorities. Make sure you do everything like the locator forms, all of that, and continue to travel. It's an extra inconvenience, but continue to travel.
Okay, and one final question from a texter. Are over 60s advised not to travel at this stage?
That's a very interesting one, because the World Health Organization came out with a general advice yesterday saying over 60s unvaccinated, that's a really important word, should avoid travel. Okay. That's World Health Organization advice. World Health Organization advice, by the way, is keep the routes open. They've condemned this practice of stopping air routes to African countries as soon as a COVID outbreak occurs, a new variant occurs.
Yeah, it's disincentivizing Africa to report any further strains, I think.
If this had happened in Brussels, I don't think they'd have cut all the routes to Brussels.
No.
It's almost like neo-colonialism in this world. It's almost racist in the way we implement this.
Okay, different discussion altogether. But for now, over 60s advised not to travel only if they're unvaccinated.
We'll park that with Manchester United in the different discussion area. But you're absolutely right. Over 60s, it doesn't apply in Ireland. Nearly all our over 60s are vaccinated. But the World Health Organisation our advice from yesterday is over 60s who are unvaccinated should avoid travel.
Okay. Eoghan Corry from Air and Travel Magazine, thank you as always for being so informative for our listeners.
Always a great pleasure, mate.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Neil Prendeville, the voice of Cork. Weekdays 9 to 12. Cork's Red FM.